Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been different from the other soldiers.
At 28, she possessed an unusual combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering determination that made her superiors both proud and uncomfortable. Her small frame often fooled people into underestimating her, but those who served alongside her knew better. She could outshoot most men in her unit and had a mind that worked like a chess master, always thinking 3 moves ahead. The mission briefing had been routine that Tuesday morning in Afghanistan.
Intelligence suggested a high-value target was hiding in a remote village near the Pakistani border.
The operation was supposed to be simple: get in, capture or eliminate the target, and extract before dawn.
Sarah's team of 8 elite soldiers had trained for months for missions exactly like this one.
Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the briefing room, his weathered face serious as he outlined the mission parameters. Sarah sat in the front row, taking careful notes as always. She had served under Webb for 3 years and respected him, though she sometimes questioned his old-school approach to warfare.
Webb believed in following orders without question, while Sarah believed in adapting to survive.
The helicopter ride to the drop zone was tense but normal. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, ensuring her rifle was clean and her communication device was working properly. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez sat across from her, nervously tapping his fingers against his knee. He was new to the unit, having joined only 2 months earlier. Sarah had taken him under her wing, teaching him the subtle art of staying alive in hostile territory. The village appeared quiet as their helicopter approached the landing zone 2 kilometers away. Sarah felt the familiar knot in her stomach that came before every mission. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. The intelligence reports had been too clean, too perfect. In her experience, real intelligence was messy and full of gaps. As they rappelled down from the helicopter, Sarah noticed unusual activity in the surrounding hills.
Small flashes of light that could have been reflections from weapons or optical equipment.
She immediately radioed her concerns to base, but Colonel Webb's voice crackled back with orders to proceed as planned.
The mission was too important to abort based on suspicion alone.
The team moved through the darkness like ghosts, using hand signals and night vision equipment to navigate the rocky terrain. Sarah took point, her senses heightened and alert for any sign of danger. Behind her, Rodriguez stayed close, following her movements exactly as she had taught him. The rest of the team spread out in a defensive formation that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises.
When they reached the village perimeter, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed.
The place was completely empty, not even dogs or chickens remained. Windows were shuttered, and no smoke rose from chimneys despite the cold mountain air. This wasn't a sleeping village, it was a trap waiting to spring. She immediately called for extraction, her voice urgent but controlled over the radio.
"Command, this is Strike Team Alpha. Village appears abandoned. Request immediate extraction. Over."
The response that came back chilled her blood. Webb's voice was cold and final: negative, Alpha.
Complete your mission as ordered. Target is confirmed inside the compound.
Sarah knew this was wrong, but military protocol demanded obedience. She led her team deeper into the village, every instinct screaming danger. The compound they were targeting sat at the village center, a 2-story building with thick walls and narrow windows.
It looked more like a fortress than a family home.
As they approached the compound, Sarah noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt and cigarette butts that were still warm. Someone had been here recently, but not their target. She was beginning to understand the true nature of their situation when the first shot rang out from the hills surrounding the village. The ambush was perfectly coordinated. Muzzle flashes erupted from dozens of positions around the village, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped Sarah's team in the open. She screamed orders over the gunfire, directing her men to whatever cover they could find. Rodriguez took a bullet in the shoulder within the first 30 seconds, and Sarah dragged him behind a stone wall while returning fire. Her radio crackled with frantic calls for support, but the responses from command became increasingly evasive. "Air support is 10 minutes out," came Webb's voice, though Sarah could hear something strange in his tone.
10 minutes was a lifetime in a firefight like this.
The enemy fighters were well positioned and well armed. They had obviously been planning this ambush for days, possibly weeks. Sarah realized with growing horror that someone had fed them detailed information about the mission timing and approach routes. This level of preparation was impossible without inside knowledge. As bullets whined overhead and her ammunition ran low, Sarah made a desperate call to base. "Command, we need immediate extraction." This was a setup. Repeat, this was a setup. The radio stayed silent for long seconds before Webb's voice returned, flattened, emotionless. "Strike Team Alpha, you are on your own. Mission parameters have changed." The betrayal hit Sarah harder than any bullet could have. Her own command was abandoning them to die. She looked around at her team, seeing the same realization dawning in their eyes. Rodriguez was bleeding heavily, and 2 other soldiers were already down. They had been sacrificed for reasons they couldn't understand. But Sarah Chen was not the type of person to accept death quietly. She began formulating an escape plan even as enemy bullets chewed up the stone wall protecting them. She knew these mountains from previous missions and remembered a series of caves about 2 kilometers north of their position. If they could break out of the kill zone, they might have a chance. "Listen up," she shouted over the gunfire to her remaining team members. "We're going to move in pairs to the north wall. Rodriguez, can you run?" The wounded sergeant nodded grimly, clutching his shoulder. Sarah pulled out her last smoke grenade and prepared to give the order that would either save them or get them all killed. The smoke provided just enough cover for them to reach the village's northern edge, but 3 more team members fell during the desperate sprint. Sarah found herself alone with Rodriguez and 1 other soldier, Corporal James Park, a quiet man from Oregon who never panicked under pressure. As they ran through the darkness toward the caves, Sarah's mind was already working on longer-term survival. They had minimal supplies, no support, and were deep in enemy territory. Worse, their own military had written them off as dead. But Sarah had learned something important about survival during her years in special forces. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. The caves provided temporary shelter, but Sarah knew they would need to keep moving. Enemy patrols would be searching for survivors, and staying in one place too long meant certain death. As she tended to Rodriguez's wound with supplies from her medical kit, she made a promise to herself and her men. "They left us here to die," she said quietly, her voice hard with determination. "But we're not going to die. We're going to survive, and we're going to find out why they betrayed us. And when we do, we're going to make them answer for what they've done." Rodriguez managed a weak smile despite his pain. "What's the plan, Lieutenant?" Sarah looked out at the hostile mountains surrounding them and began to formulate the most important strategy of her military career. Not a plan for completing a mission, but a plan for staying alive long enough to discover the truth and return to exact justice on those who had betrayed them. 3 months had passed since the ambush that was supposed to kill Sarah Chen and her team. The military had declared them killed in action, their families had received folded flags, and their names had been added to memorial walls back home. But Sarah was very much alive, and she had spent every day of those 3 months learning how to become someone the enemy would never expect. The first weeks had been the hardest. Rodriguez's shoulder wound had become infected, and, without proper medical supplies, Sarah had been forced to perform field surgery using a knife sterilized over a small fire. Park had developed severe dysentery from contaminated water, leaving Sarah to care for both men while constantly moving to avoid enemy patrols. They had survived by becoming ghosts in the mountains. Sarah's tactical training proved invaluable as she taught her men how to move without leaving tracks, how to find water in the driest terrain, and how to steal supplies from enemy positions without being detected. She discovered she had a natural talent for blending into local populations, something her instructors at Quantico had never taught her. The breakthrough came when they encountered a group of Afghan villagers who had been displaced by the same terrorist organization that had ambushed Sarah's team. These people had no love for the Taliban fighters who had destroyed their homes and killed their livestock. An elderly man named Hamid became their unlikely ally after Sarah used her medical training to save his grandson from a severe fever. Hamid spoke broken English and told Sarah disturbing stories about recent changes in the region. Foreign fighters with advanced equipment had arrived months before her mission, led by a man who seemed to know exactly when and where American forces would strike. These fighters had been preparing specific ambush sites, as if they had detailed intelligence about upcoming operations. Sarah began to understand the scope of the betrayal. Someone within the American military command structure was feeding information to the enemy, and her team had been deliberately sent into a trap. The question was why? What could be gained by sacrificing an elite special forces unit? As her team regained their strength, Sarah started conducting reconnaissance missions against enemy positions. She discovered that the terrorist organization had grown significantly more sophisticated in recent months. They were using encrypted communication equipment that was far too advanced for typical Taliban fighters. Someone was supplying them with technology and training that could only come from a major military power. Rodriguez proved to be surprisingly good at electronic surveillance once his shoulder healed. Before joining the military, he had worked as a computer technician, and he managed to intercept several radio transmissions that revealed the enemy's communication patterns. Park, meanwhile, had become an expert at moving through hostile territory without detection, his naturally quiet demeanor serving him well in their new role as intelligence gatherers. Sarah's Arabic language skills, which had been basic during her initial deployment, improved rapidly through necessity. She could now pass as a local woman when properly disguised, allowing her to gather intelligence from markets and gathering places where American soldiers could never go. The information she collected painted a picture of systematic betrayal that reached high levels of military command. The most shocking discovery came when Sarah intercepted a satellite phone conversation between an American voice and someone speaking Arabic. The American was providing detailed information about troop movements and planned operations, receiving payment instructions for a Swiss bank account in return. Sarah recorded the conversation using a device she had taken from a dead enemy fighter, but she couldn't identify the American voice without better equipment. Living among the local population had taught Sarah valuable lessons about survival and warfare that weren't covered in any military manual. She learned how to read the subtle signs that indicated enemy presence, how to identify which villagers could be trusted, and how to move supplies and personnel without attracting attention. These skills would prove crucial for what she was planning next. Sarah had decided that merely surviving wasn't enough. She needed to return to American forces with proof of the betrayal, but, more importantly, she needed to rescue other soldiers who might be walking into similar traps. Intelligence gathered from local sources suggested that 3 more Special Forces teams had been ambushed in the past month using the same tactics that had nearly killed her unit. The plan she developed was audacious and dangerous. She would infiltrate the enemy's main communication center, located in a fortified compound about 50 kilometers from their current position. If successful, she could gather enough evidence to expose the traitor and potentially prevent future ambushes. If she failed, her team would almost certainly be captured and executed. Rodriguez had serious concerns about the plan. "Lieutenant, we barely survived the last fight, and that was with a full team and air support. Now you want to attack a fortified position with 3 people?" Sarah understood his fears, but she also understood something that her military training had never taught her: sometimes the most impossible plans succeeded because no one expected them. "They think we're dead, Rodriguez. That's our greatest advantage. They're not watching for 3 ghosts who are supposed to be buried in Arlington Cemetery." Preparation took weeks of careful observation and intelligence gathering. Sarah mapped every guard rotation, every supply delivery, and every communication schedule at the target compound. She identified the best approach routes and planned multiple escape paths for different scenarios. Most importantly, she began recruiting local allies who had their own reasons for wanting to strike back at the terrorist organization. Hamid proved instrumental in this effort. His extended family had suffered greatly under the occupation, and several of his relatives were willing to provide assistance in exchange for weapons and the promise of future protection. Sarah was careful not to put these civilians in unnecessary danger, but their local knowledge and support would be essential for success. The night before the mission, Sarah sat with her 2 remaining team members in a hidden cave overlooking their target. Rodriguez had fashioned improvised explosive devices using materials salvaged from enemy positions. Park had scouted 3 different escape routes and cached supplies along each path. Sarah had memorized the layout of the communication center and
practiced the sequence of actions she would need to perform once inside. "You know this is probably a suicide mission," Park said quietly, checking his weapon for the 20th time that day. Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I know. But, if we don't do this, how many more teams are going to die? How many more families are going to get those folded flags because some bastard is selling American soldiers to the highest bidder?" Rodriguez finished preparing the explosives and looked up at his lieutenant. "So what's the real plan here, Sarah? We get the evidence, but, then, what? We're still officially dead. Even if we make it back to American lines, who's going to believe us?" That was the question Sarah had been wrestling with for weeks. Simply gathering evidence wouldn't be enough if the traitor had enough influence to discredit their testimony. She needed something more dramatic, something that would force the military leadership to take action. "We're not just going back with evidence," she said finally. "We're going to use what we learned to save American lives in real time. When we discover who the traitor is, we're going to turn the tables and feed them false information that leads their terrorist friends into a trap." The plan was risky beyond measure, but it was also their only chance to honor the memory of their fallen teammates and prevent future betrayals. Sarah looked out at the enemy compound, knowing that tomorrow night would either mark the beginning of their revenge or the end of their unlikely survival story. 6 months after being declared dead, Lieutenant Saracen stood at the perimeter of Forward Operating Base Hammer, watching American soldiers who had no idea they were looking at a ghost. She had lost 30 pounds during her time in the mountains, her hair was black instead of its natural brown, and her skin was weathered by months of harsh conditions. But her eyes held a fire that burned brighter than ever before. The infiltration of the enemy communications center had been successful beyond her wildest hopes. Sarah and her team had not only gathered evidence of the betrayal but had also discovered the identity of the traitor, Colonel Marcus Webb himself, the man who had sent them to die. The recorded conversations they had captured revealed a conspiracy that went back over 2 years and had resulted in the deaths of dozens of American soldiers. Webb had been selling mission details to a sophisticated terrorist network in exchange for payments that totaled over $2 million. But money wasn't his only motivation. The recordings revealed that he had gambling debts to dangerous people and had been threatened with exposure of other criminal activities unless he cooperated. The betrayal of Sarah's team had been a test of his reliability, proof that he would sacrifice his own soldiers to protect himself. Getting back to American forces had required all of Sarah's newfound skills in deception and infiltration. She couldn't simply walk up to the front gate and announce herself, because Webb would be notified immediately. Instead, she had spent weeks observing the base's routines and identifying soldiers she could trust with her explosive revelation. The opportunity came when she recognized Sergeant Major Tom Morrison during a supply run to a nearby village. Morrison had been her instructor during advanced training 3 years earlier, and she knew he was beyond reproach. More importantly, he had contacts in military intelligence who could bypass normal command channels if necessary. Sarah's reappearance at the village market, disguised as a local woman, had nearly given Morrison a heart attack. She approached him carefully, speaking in Arabic at first before switching to English just loud enough for him to hear. "Tom, it's Sarah Chin. Don't react. I'm supposed to be dead, and if certain people find out I'm alive, I will be." The reunion took place in an abandoned building on the village outskirts, with Rodriguez and Park providing security. Morrison listened in stunned silence as Sarah played the recorded conversations that proved Webb's treachery. When the evidence was complete, the grizzled sergeant major sat in silence for long minutes, his face cycling through shock, anger, and grim determination. "Jesus Christ, Sarah. Do you understand what you're telling me? Webb has been a rising star in the command structure. He's being considered for promotion to general. If these recordings are authentic, this goes all the way to the Pentagon." Sarah had anticipated this reaction. "I know how big this is, Tom. That's why I need you to help me do this right. We can't just turn over the evidence and hope for the best. Webb has too many friends in high places. We need to catch him in the act and make his guilt impossible to deny." The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah would use the enemy's own communication equipment to send Webb false intelligence about a planned special forces raid.
If he took the bait and passed the information to his terrorist contacts, they would intercept his communications and catch him red-handed. But the plan required perfect timing and cooperation from military intelligence personnel who could operate outside normal command channels. Morrison's contacts in intelligence proved more extensive than Sarah had hoped. Within 48 hours, she found herself in a secure meeting with Captain Lisa Zhang from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Zhang had been investigating suspicious patterns in mission failures and was eager to test Sarah's evidence against her own findings. "We've suspected a high-level leak for months," Zhang explained, "but we couldn't identify the source. Your recordings fill in missing pieces that we couldn't explain any other way. If you're willing to help us catch Webb in the act, we can guarantee that justice will be served." The trap was set for the following Tuesday. Sarah would provide Webb with false intelligence about a planned raid on a terrorist safe house, complete with detailed timing and approach routes. Intelligence personnel would monitor all communications from the base, ready to intercept Webb's inevitable contact with his terrorist handlers. Meanwhile, a real special forces team would be standing by to capture the terrorists when they positioned themselves for an ambush that would never come. Sarah's return to the base required careful orchestration. She couldn't simply walk through the front gate, because Webb would be alerted immediately. Instead, Zhang arranged for her to be captured during a routine patrol and brought in as a suspected insurgent. Only after being processed through initial security would her true identity be revealed to selected personnel. The deception worked perfectly. When Sarah was brought into the base detention facility, wearing traditional Afghan clothing and speaking only Arabic, no one suspected her true identity. The soldiers who processed her were professional but firm, treating her exactly as they would any other detainee. Only when Zhang arrived for the interrogation was Sarah's identity revealed to the shocked personnel present. Word of Sarah's miraculous survival spread through the base like wildfire, but Zhang had anticipated this reaction. A cover story was quickly circulated claiming that Sarah had escaped from her captors and had been hiding in the mountains while recovering from injuries. The story was plausible enough to explain her changed appearance and her months of absence. Webb's reaction to news of Sarah's survival was everything they had hoped for. Within hours, he was demanding private meetings with her to debrief about her experiences. Sarah played her role perfectly, acting like a traumatized soldier who was grateful to be back under his protection. She provided him with carefully crafted intelligence about terrorist positions and activities, including the false information about the planned raid. The moment of truth came 2 days later. Intelligence monitoring equipment detected Webb making an encrypted call to an unknown number, passing along details of the planned raid in exchange for confirmation of his latest payment. The call was recorded in perfect clarity, providing undeniable proof of his treachery. But Webb's betrayal was discovered at a cost no one had anticipated. The terrorist organization, realizing they had been compromised, launched a desperate attack on the base itself. Sarah found herself once again in combat, but this time she was fighting to protect her fellow soldiers rather than simply trying to survive. The attack came just before dawn, with dozens of fighters attempting to breach the base perimeter using inside knowledge of defensive positions. Sarah's experience in guerrilla warfare proved invaluable as she helped coordinate the defense, using tactics she had learned during her months in the mountains to predict and counter enemy movements. When the shooting stopped, Webb made one final attempt to eliminate the evidence against him. He tried to kill Sarah during the confusion of the battle, claiming she had been compromised by her captors and posed a security threat. But Rodriguez and Park were watching, and they intervened before Webb could complete his final betrayal. The confrontation took place in front of dozens of witnesses, including Zhang and several other intelligence personnel. Webb's desperate attempt to murder Sarah while claiming she was a security threat only confirmed his guilt in the most dramatic way possible. When he was finally arrested, the evidence against him was overwhelming and impossible to deny. Sarah's return from the dead had accomplished more than just exposing one traitor. The intelligence she had gathered during her months in hiding led to the disruption of the entire terrorist network Webb had been supporting. Dozens of enemy fighters were captured or killed, and their sophisticated communication and supply networks were destroyed. As Webb was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You should have died in that village," he snarled.
Sarah met his gaze with calm satisfaction. Maybe I did die there. But what came back was something you never expected and couldn't control. The official investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Webb's treachery. His betrayal had resulted in the deaths of 37 American soldiers and the compromise of dozens of classified operations. But his arrest also revealed something more important: the resilience and determination of soldiers who refused to accept betrayal and death as the final word in their story. Sarah Chen had returned from the dead not for revenge, but for justice. Her survival and eventual triumph proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against betrayal is the refusal to stay buried when others try to write your obituary.